Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to get into something that I think is super relevant to, well, pretty much everyone, and that's the impact trauma can have on how we see ourselves.
Yeah, it's a big one, right? And we've got some really interesting stuff to dig into today, pulling from a psychotherapy book that goes really deep on the mechanics of trauma. And then, this is what I think is so cool, we're going to bring in the dawn of everything, that historical analysis to see how maybe, just maybe, our individual experiences of trauma could actually reflect some like bigger historical and cultural things happening. Whoa.
That's kind of what I love about this show. It's like we take these different pieces of the puzzle and we see how they fit together to give us this whole new picture of what it means to be human.
Exactly. And sometimes those pieces come from unexpected places, right? Like, who would have thought a deep dive into history could shed light on our own personal struggles with trauma?
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of structural dissociation from the psychotherapy book. So, like, when we think of trauma, it's easy to picture these really extreme cases. But this book is saying that a lot of times, trauma's impact is way more subtle, way more nuanced.
It's not about having like multiple personalities or anything like that. It's about having different parts of ourselves that are holding on to different experiences, different memories, almost like imagine different operating systems running at the same time within you. Each one has its own kind of way of processing the world.
So, it's less about being one whole me and more about having these distinct parts, each with its own history, its own perspective. And that explains why, like, you can feel totally safe one minute and then totally on edge the next, right?
Yeah.
It's like these conflicting experiences are all happening at the same time.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense when you think about how our brains are wired for both connection and self protection at the same time. The book calls these our action systems. And sometimes, after we've experienced something traumatic, these systems can kind of get stuck. Like your internal danger alarm is going off all the time, even when there's no real threat present.
It's like your body's stuck in this state of
Yeah.
high alert, even when your mind, like, logically knows that you're safe, right?
Totally. And that's where that whole mind body connection comes in because it's not just in your head, it's like it's in every cell of your being.
Right. It's like, think about it, a racing heart, rapid breathing,
Yeah.
tense muscles. Those are all physical things, right? They're all physical manifestations of what's going on inside.
Exactly. The body remembers even when the mind's trying its best to forget. It's wild.
That makes me think about how this book talks about mindfulness, like how clients are taught to actually tune in to those internal sensations, those physical things, and just notice them without judgment. It's like becoming an observer in your own body.
Yeah, it's about bridging that gap between what your mind's telling you and what your body's actually feeling. It's powerful stuff. And that's where therapy can really come in handy, which we'll dive into a bit more later on.
Okay, so we're back, and we're really diving deep into how therapy can help us work with those parts of ourselves, especially after we've experienced trauma.
You know, what gets me is how compassionate and curious this psychotherapy book is about those parts. It's not like make them go away. It's more about, hey, where'd you guys come from? What are you afraid of? It's really refreshing.
It's like instead of seeing these parts as the enemy, they're more like messengers,
Yeah,
right? Like parts of ourselves that are trying to protect us, even if their methods are, a little outdated.
totally. They're doing their best with what they've got. But yeah, the book digs into this idea of unblending, which I thought was interesting. Basically, it's about learn to separate out your reactions and being like, okay, that's not necessarily me feeling that way. That's this part of me.
Yeah, it's so easy to get wrapped up in those feelings and think, this is who I am. But unblending allows us to step back and say, wait, this is just a part of me and it doesn't have to define me. It's like creating some breathing room.
Exactly. And there's this great story in the book about a client, Suzanne. She was really scared of unblending at first because she thought it meant like losing those parts of herself completely.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I could see how that would be terrifying. Like these parts, even if they're struggling, they're still a part of you, right?
Totally. But the therapist explained that it wasn't about getting rid of those parts, but more about creating space to understand them, to see them as separate from that core self.
That's a big difference. Like instead of feeling like I am anxiety, it's more like there's a part of me that's feeling anxious right now, and I can choose how I want to respond to that.
Right. And that's empowering, right? That's where freedom starts to come in. And speaking of freedom, this is where the dawn of everything brings up something so wild. They talk about how some indigenous cultures actually saw Europeans as less free because they were so hung up on rules and authority, like all the
I
time.
mean, really? Like they were seen as less free because they valued security. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Right. It's like a completely different way of looking at it. The book talks about how Western thought tends to connect freedom with ownership, owning things, owning rights, being in control of your destiny.
Yeah, like you have to earn it somehow.
Right. But some indigenous cultures, they saw freedom as something you're born with, something inherent, not something you acquire.
It makes me wonder if, like, by focusing so much on those external structures, those hierarchies, maybe they were missing out on a kind of inner freedom that wasn't dependent on circumstances or what other people said or did.
That's what I got from it, for sure. And they have this one quote that just nails it. He says, "They imagine that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever except when they like just radical self determination built right in."
Wow, that is powerful. Okay, so we're talking about freedom that comes from within, not something granted from the outside. That feels really relevant when we're thinking about how trauma can make us feel trapped by our own reactions, right?
Absolutely. And it makes you question that whole Western emphasis on individualism. Like maybe it's actually limiting us both as individuals and as a society.
All right, so we're back, wrapping up this deep dive. And wow, we really covered some ground, huh? Trauma, freedom, what it even means to be human. It's a lot.
It is, right. But what's amazing is that we're not just talking about these big concepts in a vacuum. Both of these sources we're looking at, the psychotherapy book and the Dawn of Everything, they both offer like real, tangible ways to take this knowledge and actually do something with it. It's about how we live, how we connect, even how we might structure our world differently.
Yeah, love that. So let's bring it down to earth for a sec. The therapy book talks about how every time we show up for those younger parts of ourselves, those parts that are maybe still stuck in trauma, it's not just about making them feel better in the moment. It's actually changing something deeper.
For sure. It's like we're rewriting those old stories, those patterns that got ingrained in us from way back when.
And as we do that, as we heal those internal things, it's bound to change how we interact with like literally everything and everyone around us.
100%. The book says it so beautifully. Each repair reclaims a part that was once left behind, retrieves a lost soul. I mean, come on, that's powerful stuff.
I got chills. It's like we're not just broken things that need to be fixed, right? We're reclaiming those lost parts of ourselves, the parts we might have shut down or pushed away to survive. And in doing that, we become more whole, more compassionate, not just for ourselves, but for like everyone around us.
And this is where I think the historical stuff from the Dawn of Everything comes in so perfectly. It's like, what if we applied that same logic, that same openness to complexity, to how we structure society as a whole?
Mind blown. Like instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold, we create a world where there's space for everyone to be themselves, even to like change and evolve.
It's about shifting from a model of domination to a model of cooperation. And I don't know about you, but that feels a lot more aligned with like the human spirit.
And if you really think about it, that sense of cooperation, that empathy and shared humanity, isn't that what we're already cultivating within ourselves through this work of healing from trauma? It's like inner transformation and outer transformation go hand in hand.
Exactly. It's like that quote we talked about earlier, right? About those indigenous cultures seeing that inherent freedom, that self-determination. It's already there within us. It's in our DNA. It's in the very fabric of who we are. It's like, what if by healing ourselves, by reclaiming those lost parts of ourselves, we're also planting the seeds for a different kind of future, a future where that kind of interconnectedness and radical acceptance aren't just lofty ideals, but the very foundation of how we live and relate to one another.
That is a powerful vision, my friend. And as always, we're leaving you with more questions than answers. But I think the most important takeaway from today is this. What if the key to a better world, a more just and compassionate world, isn't out there somewhere? What if it's right here within each and every one of us?
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Right, for sure. All right, everyone, thanks for coming along on this deep dive with us. Keep those questions coming, keep the conversations going, and most importantly, keep diving deep.